How are you? It's Wednesday morning, 8:30. Are you having a good time? Are you just having a blast? Yeah? Are you sure you got some sleep last night? Okay. Well, we are thrilled to have you here, and I got to tell you, this is an exciting topic, and I'm sure you're all excited to hear what we're going to be talking about today, our distinguished panel of speakers here. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Dr. Victoria Grady, and I'm going to ask her a question that I think we'd probably all love to hear the answer. So Dr. Grady,
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you guys. How do you feel from last night?
We're going to be asking for a little two-step, you know.
Singing and dancing is not happening, but okay.
Come on. So Dr. Grady, could you please let us know, is there ever change in Washington? We'd love to know why this topic is so important to you.
So this topic is important to me and to our whole team because we've all had the opportunity to learn about many fantastic different change models. But what we found is that there are nuances to some of those change models that make them maybe not as successful, maybe not as quickly as we would like for them to be. So I personally decided that I would begin to explore other areas that weren't necessarily directly related to change. And that led me down a path to explore something called attachment behavior. And it was that behavior that gave me a new perspective and a new idea about how to look at integrating a theory from an area of developmental psychology into our area related to change management. So there we go.
Great. Sure, we'll be hearing a little bit more about that. That's great. Now I'd also like to introduce you to Heidi Fieselman. Morning, Heidi.
Good morning.
We have a question for you as well. So Heidi, what we'd like to ask you, if you would consider yourself a change expert, and I know you are, on a specific subject or topic or theme, what would that be and why?
So, excuse me, over the past, I would say 5 to 6 years, I've been doing a lot of change management around advancing data analytics capabilities at first at Booz Allen, with our federal government partners, and now I just recently transitioned to the Washington, D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department. So now I'm doing it more on a local level, but it's still kind of combining data analytics, advanced analytics, and change management, as well as now policing. So,
marvelous.
Thank you.
Marvelous. It's great that the three of you got together. And then also Dr. Patrick McCreesh. So Dr. McCreesh, glad to have you here. So we'd like for you to share with us your favorite quote around this subject.
Yeah, so
change.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm father of 3 little girls, and Frozen plays constantly in our house. You can't quite get out of it. But there's this great scene where the oldest troll rolls up to them and says that the heart is not so easy to change, but the head can be persuaded. And it always sticks with me because that's a lot of what our work is. And so, you know, like many people, I return to Disney for my high-minded quotations.
There you go. Well, thank you 3 for being here. We're really thrilled. I'm going to turn the stage over to the 3 of you, so we're all ears.
Great, thank you, Carla.
I don't know if that's a Disney quote or not.
So thank you all for coming this morning. It's 8:30 in the morning on Wednesday, and we really appreciate you all being here. I noticed that a lot of people sat on this side of the room. I promise, I know in a lot of cases it makes sense to go and shop the other presentations at the same time, but you don't want to do that because you're going to miss a lot of good stuff that's at the end of the presentation. So stick with us. I kind of want to take you back for a second to start this conversation. So I'm going to ask you all to close your eyes. We're going to do a little time traveling. We're going to go back to 2014. Back when kind of third-rate reality billionaires were on NBC primetime and not on MSNBC. You know what I'm talking about, right? You're sitting in a big conference space just like this, exactly like this. They're all exactly the same. They don't look that different. The Gaylord's got their own carpet, but that's it. Your head's pounding a little bit because you're kind of hungover from the night before. That might be true to form for some of you right now. And your organization has a lot of data, and you know you have a lot of data. and you know you have to do a lot of things around change management, and you don't know, how do I use the data that I have to inform my change practices? And then you see a presentation. You can open your eyes now. You see a presentation by Dr. Grady, where she walks you through her Change Diagnostic Index, a survey that she created to try to figure out how ready an organization is for change, how ready each individual is for change. And you think, maybe I should go talk to her, maybe I should buy her survey, or maybe I can take what she's doing and apply it to the data I already have. And so that's what started our conversation 2 years ago at the ACMP 2014 conference. I think there's two important things that come out of this experience. The first is that I think it's good in our 5th year of an organization like ACMP that we're actually starting to collaborate and get a real strong dialogue going that builds presentations on top of each other. So for the organizational health of ACMP, I encourage all of you, if you saw something here today that you feel like you could improve upon or collaborate with, that you give that a shot. The second is that change readiness is something that's critically important before you start your change exercise, but you might already have the information you need within your organization to get started. And so today is really a case study around how to use your own data to inform change readiness. We do it about Washington because we're all from Washington and that's where we work. But really think of this as a case study. And I'd ask you one other thing. I know you all are going to be tweeting. I know you all are going to be using your app. If you wouldn't mind just using a hashtag, attach the number 2, change. It'll make sense as we go through the presentation, but that's just kind of my quick ask of you before we get started. All right? Now, let's go into it. So, we're going to ask you a couple questions. You know what? Why don't we all stand up? Let's get moving. Let's get some blood going. What do you think of when you think of Washington, D.C.? Just yell it out. I'm going to repeat it for the video. So, traffic, gridlock, love it. What else?
So true.
Anger, hate. Okay, not yet. What's government, Obama, history, slow, government employees, quagmire. Okay, good, good. All right. Sorry? Paycheck? Okay, yeah. Me too. Okay, good. All right, so now we're going to change it. Some of you already went here, but when you think of federal government employees, what do you think of? Long-term bureaucracy? Overworked? Frustrated? Dedicated? Transient? What? Spouse. Nice. Resistant. Amen. Consulting. Anything else? Ooh, destruction of souls. Wow, we could go into that one. What are you doing after this? You want to go to the bar and talk that one through?
That's funny.
All right. Okay, you all can sit down. So I do think there's some pretty common perceptions of DC. You all kind of threw a bunch of them out. I don't think any of them are wrong. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of behavior in Washington that's stale, stagnant, resistant, soul-crushing. All these things might be true. I also do a lot of public policy work where I try to remind people that everyone operates in a rational system in a rational way, and when a system is set up in a certain way, you get very rational behavior. So try to think of the bureaucrats in the federal government as actually incredibly rational actors who live in a world of a lot of constraints and with incentives that may not be right and may be off, but that's not their fault. They're operating within that system. So you all threw out a lot of different things. Here's one, right? We know this. It's, back and forth, arguing, anger, hate, all of that comes to fruition here. I love this one. I use it all the time. We kind of think, well, the president's a clown. Congress doesn't do anything. It's totally misguided. And then what does that do? Well, it puts people in a lot of red tape, and they're just kind of struggling constantly, right? We can't get through the red tape. They can't get through the red tape. Nothing gets done. But I'd like to offer you a slightly different view of it. We're talking about change today, right? You don't think instantly as the federal government as a place with a lot of change. But there's a lot of change going on. Your average CEO is around for 9.5 years in Fortune 500 companies, and executives in the federal government are leaving every 2.5 years. There's 4.1 million employees with a budget of $3.7 trillion. Individual agencies with staff of over 65,000 people manage over $1 trillion on an annual basis. These are very large organizations. There's IT change all the time. Federal agencies are going through the same thing that all of your organizations are. How do we bring in Agile? How do we do big data? How do we improve our IT? They're spending $81.6 billion of your money to improve IT, for those of you who are US citizens. The rest of you have, paid your dues coming into the country. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And all of these changes cause federal employees to ask some very rational questions. Yes, there's change now. Yes, I can change, but everything else is going to change around me. It's the constant state of change that Tim attempted to debunk the other day in his presentation. If I'm in a constant state of change, should I ever change? Well, we have some good news to tell you. There are individuals in the federal government who do want to change, when we've been able to find them. And a lot of the resistance that you would expect is there, but it's not consistent, and it can be managed. And that's what we're going to talk to you about today. So here's the map for the rest of the conversation. When we got together a couple years ago, we realized we had a lot of data and we had a diagnostic. How did we bring them together? Well, we knew that ProSci research tells us that desire is the biggest hurdle. So we wanted to focus on desire. And we wanted to focus on what it is that causes individuals to have the desire to change or not have the desire to change. Dr. Grady has done a lot of research around attachment theory. She's going to walk you through that and explain how it supports our research. She also developed a nice change readiness tool that I mentioned earlier that she presented in Orlando. And we applied the data that we have around federal employees to that tool, or vice versa, the tool to the employees. From the findings, we're going to show you a number of the different symptoms that lead to an organization being ready to change or not ready to change. And then we're going to give you some of the remedies that can help you in an organization that is showing that it's ready to change versus not ready to change. And last, we have 7 agencies in particular that we profile. And I just want to point out, you all have this presentation. It's in your app. You can see it. I'm telling you that now because we did 7 profiles, and depending on how fast we go over the next 30 minutes, we may or may not get to them all, but that's okay. It's in the app. You also are going to see a lot of data on these slides. That's also there for you to consume. Don't worry about capturing it all as we go through. Any questions? Are we good? All right. And remember, the hashtag is #attach2change. Victoria?
Okay, so we're going to start out with just a brief conversation about the brain. And 2 years ago when I presented in 2014, I didn't talk about the brain. I didn't talk about neuropsychology or neuroscience because at that point I didn't understand the implications. And as that's become a bigger part of the conversation that we're all having, I mean, we've seen presentations on mind mapping. We heard Sean Aker talk to us about that on Monday. The neurology behind why we do things is becoming increasingly more important. So I spent some time with a neurologist, an MD neurologist, and then a neuropsychologist over the course of the last 2 years. And it's a fascinating conversation because they don't even agree about where this instinct resides in the brain. What we came to decision collectively as the 3 of us is that we're going to say that this comes in the limbic system, right? But there's 2 parts of the limbic system that are potentially at play here. One's called the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus controls something called your fight-flight response. And so when you're introducing change, you're probably seeing some of your employees or the folks that you're working with or the clients that you're working with exhibiting something called a fight-flight response. Oh, no, you don't, right? I am not going to talk about that change. And some of them are like, okay, I'm out of here, right? So they're either fighting you or they're gone, right? And the other place is called the amygdala, right? And the amygdala is the little red dot that you can see on this picture. The amygdala is where we control emotions, and it's where fear is managed. And so, interestingly, the neuropsychologist and the neurologist don't agree, right, about exactly where something called human instinct resides. And attachment theory and attachment behavior is part of human instinct. We do it as humans, but also primates do it. Lambs do it. Bugs do it. It's an instinct that's ingrained into who we are, and we can't stop it, right? You can manage it, but you can't stop it. And so that's the important piece that I saw a few years ago when I originally started my research on attachment theory, is understanding what is this instinct that we have to either push back or embrace change, right? And how do you understand where that comes from? And that's the piece that I identified as what was missing from some of the other models and literature that we've been able to develop over the last 20 plus years as we've become more focused on understanding how change actually impacts organizations. So let's talk for a few minutes about attachment theory and the role that attachment theory plays. And there's a lot of text on this slide, and I realize that, but we, again, just like Patrick said, the slides are available to you so that you don't need to write all this down. You can just listen kind of to what we're talking about. So we know that there's an abundance of literature that tells us how that we're gonna have to deal with change, and especially in Washington, change is a constant, right? And I heard that over and over again over the last 3 days. The change process never ends, and my organization is constant. It's chaotic. You can't manage something that's that chaotic, but you have to, right? And so you have to add a process on top of that chaos, or it's gonna get even worse. Right? So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the objects that people rely on as you go through that chaos. So when you were a child, some of you may have had something called a transitional object, right? And that transitional object is identified. You don't even remember it, probably most of you, maybe a couple of you do, but most of you don't, because it happens between 0 and 8 months, right? So when you recognize, oh crap, me and my mom are not the same thing anymore, right? Or whoever gave birth to you, if it wasn't your mom. But we're no longer the same thing. And so you gravitate towards an object. It could be a blanket. It could be a pacifier. It could be a mobile. It could be the idea of how you're put to bed every night, right? So you gravitate towards that idea, that object. And then that object is it's called a transitional object. It's your security while you deal with, if you will, the fact that you and the person that gave birth to you are not one thing. So after you reconcile that, you could be somewhere around 3, 4 years old. Some of us still have those transitional objects. My kids both have them, and so I'm not going to tell you whether or not I do. Mine might be hidden in a drawer somewhere, and but nobody needs to know exactly what that is. But we typically we let go, we detach from that original object, and then we find something else. Maybe it's soccer, maybe it's your friend, maybe it's your teacher. But throughout life, you continuously attach and detach, attach and detach. So by the time you're in the workplace, you're still doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. But now it's a leader, right? Or it may be a lunch group, or it may be a business process, or it may be an idea. For me, it might be a piece of technology. Technology is something I gravitate towards and I attach to with a ferocious dedication. And I hate it when somebody starts trying to change my technology. But you think to yourself, what is it that you are attached to in your place? We all are attached to something. It may not be the same level. We may have varying degrees of attachment, but we all attach to things. It could be something as silly as a placement of a coffee pot, right? It could be a break room. It could be the fact that your organization just went from an office-based organization to an open space configuration. So it's all these different things that we attach to, and these are the things that help stabilize our productivity and our performance in the workplace. Interestingly, you can measure that, and that's what I presented in 2014, and it's almost 10 years ago now that I presented the first look at this research. there's a set of individual symptoms that we have. And there's actually 8 in the original research back in the 50s and 60s, but I only focus on 6 of them because 2 of them are somatic in nature, which means that they're physiological, lack of sleep, right? So insomnia and loss of appetite. I would suggest that we could probably measure those with some folks, but for our purposes, we're going to stick with these 6. And so the original assessment measured these 6, but it gave you the results in terms of organizational equivalence. Okay, and that's what you really care about, is what those organizational equivalents look like. Morale, productivity, motivation, conflict, those are the pieces that matter to you and in the workplace. The interesting piece that Patrick mentioned, and I'm going to take another minute here, the interesting piece that Patrick mentioned is that we created this assessment, and I had never thought about the fact that you guys might not need to take a new assessment because you might already have the data. And there are a lot of organizations that have engagement surveys, job satisfaction surveys. You've already got this information out there. So we don't need to recreate the wheel by adding another assessment to your employees that they're going to push back on because it takes so much time and nobody ever does anything with it anyway. So which is part of the issue, right? Classic Hawthorne studies for those of you who have been to some type of business school. But interestingly, we don't need to use a new assessment. We can just use the data that's already there. And so that's where I'm going to turn it over to Heidi, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about how did we use data that already exists to relate to something called attachment theory that came out of the 1940s and 50s in developmental psychology. So how can we possibly relate what's going on right now to something that's old and wasn't even created as it related to organizations? So Heidi?
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk more about connecting the data to the diagnostic. So how many of you have heard of the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey? Okay, so for someone that's interested in data analytics, this is a gold mine. So the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey consists of 84 questions, and it's a tool that measures employee perceptions of their workplace. It measures kind of self-reported perceptions around job satisfaction, human capital development, knowledge management, professional development, and a lot more. And it's asked of about every year. It's administered by the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. And it's every year there's over 400,000 responses. In 2015 alone, there were 421,748 responses, and across 82 agencies. So what we did is we saw this, and we saw that consistently this has been administered every single year, and so we took those questions and we pared down the questions to, we aligned the questions with Dr. Grady's Change Diagnostic Index. And we aligned them through a series of statistical tests as well as expert judgments to get about 35 questions. And then from that, we pared it down even more, doing some correlation testing and additional subject matter expertise to get 13 questions across the 6 organizational equivalent symptoms. And then after we did that, we determined 1 Change Diagnostic Index score per agency, and we can break them down by symptom, which we'll do subsequently. But 3 kind of major findings that we found were around kind of from attachment theory perspective. Certain agencies are well positioned for change, while others need work. And as we go into some of the case studies, you'll kind of see how we connected the data with those findings. Also, transitional and attachment objects, like Dr. Grady mentioned, they vary depending on the agency. And the third is that employee satisfaction trends align pretty tightly with change readiness. And we'll get into a little bit of that additionally as well. So this kind of visual helps kind of see some of the variety of different change readiness scores that we found for each agency. So all the agencies were ranked on a scale of 1 to 5, with the agencies falling between a 3 and a 5. We wanted to, so if you look at this visual, that line should have 82 dots on it. We only wanted to show you 7 so that we can kind of talk through them and explain exactly what our approach was. So what you'll see is that at the top you have NASA and you've got the Federal Highway Administration. Then we've had the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and then it follows by the Veterans Benefit Administration, and then 3 Homeland Security agencies towards the bottom. And we wanted to show you sort of a broad range of change readiness with kind of NASA and the Federal Highway Administration towards the top, and then you've got the Transportation Security Administration, U.S. Secret Service, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement towards the bottom. And we wanted to choose these agencies to show you just because there's name recognition, and also I think we're all familiar with some of the challenges over the past 5 years that some of these agencies have been going through. So there's a lot of dots. So I'll walk through these. So on the left-hand side, what you're going to see is the kind of overall change readiness score. This was also shown on the previous slide. But what you see on the x-axis here are the 6 organizational equivalent symptoms. And there's kind of a couple groupings that we just want to point out. First, you have these two groupings by absenteeism and productivity. And as you can see, there's very little variation. They're all kind of tightly around the 4.5 area. So first, one thing to note about the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey is that it's self-reported. It is employees' perceptions of their workplace. So if they don't feel that they are absent, both either physically or mentally, they will say that they are not absent. And same with productivity. My interpretation of being a productive worker could be very different than someone I manage, for example. So another thing is that we hypothesize about this little variation is that these are things that can be kind of tightly managed. For example, I know if my employees are not coming to work. Or are not present from kind of the job site, or are not being productive in that I can kind of measure the number of work products or deliverables that they provide on a daily or weekly, monthly basis. So these are so our kind of working hypothesis is that these 2 organizational equivalent symptoms, you can manage to those. So then moving to the next kind of grouping. So down here, you've got organizational equivalent symptoms, morale, motivation, turnover. It's a lot more. You have surveys like FEVS to help you better understand your employees' morale or their motivations. It's a lot more. It's difficult to manage to those, and so you can see that there's just much larger variation. And the 2 blue dots, that's U.S. Secret Service and that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So now we are going to move on to. So we've talked about some of the diagnostic pieces, and now we're going to move on to some of the remedies.
Okay, so the transitional object is why you care about attachment theory, right? So you're saying to yourself, okay, this is all fine and good, but attachment theory, and why do I care about this, and how's it going to help me? Well, this is how it helps you, right? So you use the attachment information. You use either your own data that you already have collected, or you use data that you collect qualitatively. There's all different kinds of ways that you can get this information, but you use it to define transitional objects. The transitional object will support your employees as they process through the change. It will help increase the desire to change because they feel supported, they feel respected, they feel like this change isn't going to hurt me, this isn't going to negatively impact me. So the transitional object is a win-win in terms of defining for you as the change manager, but also for your employees because they're more productive and they perform better, and that increases profitability and all those things that we're all trying to make sure. The interesting thing about transitional objects is they're very different from organization to organization. It could be that a leader is a transitional object, and I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but the leader may embody the vision and the mission of the organization, and because they embody so much of what the organization is about, you attach to them, right? You believe that they will lead my organization in a positive way. It's been fantastic and so interesting to watch the evolution of an organization like Apple, right? Post Mr. Jobs death and how that's transitioned for employees that work there. And it's fantastic to be able to talk to people who were at Apple before and are at Apple now, and they have a whole different perspective about their mission and their vision. Interestingly, their mission and mission specifically used to be 6 or 7 words under Mr. Jobs' leadership. Go look up Apple's mission today, right? And it's several sentences. That, to me, speaks volumes about the difference in the leadership style under Mr. Cook and under Mr. Jobs, right? And so there's one example of a leadership that might be an attachment object. Let me tell you about a story, a real story, that we just did with a publishing house in the UK. So there's a publishing house in the UK called Gower Publishing. It's a relatively small publisher. And there's a huge publisher named Rutledge Taylor Francis. Anybody ever heard of Rutledge Taylor Francis or Rutledge or Taylor Francis? They merged a few years ago. Anyway, Rutledge Taylor Francis bought Gower. They didn't merge, they acquired, right? And Gower has been around for about 60 years. It's had the same leadership. It's a family-owned business the entire time. The interesting thing about Gower is that their CEO, the owner, the grandfather who started the company and still maintains that same leadership role, he is an avid art collector. He has hundreds of pieces of art. And it's everything from Picasso to Van Gogh to somebody you would never have even heard of, something he got off a street corner in Mexico because he thought it was awesome, or a street corner in Spain, or a street corner in Prague because he thought it was fantastic. And the whole office at Gower is filled with all these paintings and different art objects. So that has become, over the last 60 years, part of the culture at Gower. And so, pardon me, as he announced that he was going to, that the company was going to be acquired, he said to all his employees, based on seniority, I'm going to let everybody pick a piece of art. Now, he didn't know what he was doing, right? I mean, he knew what kind of money he was giving away. That was not the issue. He didn't realize that he was providing his employees with an incredible attachment object, a transitional object, right? It was fantastic. And, and most employees had been there at least 10 years. So 150, 200 employees. The shortest tenure was 5 years, right? So this is a great company. This is a place people want to work. And now the company's being acquired, and he's saying to you, I respect you. I respect what you've done for Gower. I respect what you've given me as an employee of Gower. And I respect you so much that I'm going to help you transition by giving you a piece of the company to take with you. And as I was brought in to work with the organization, it was fantastic because there was not a lot for me to do. Mr. Gower had done what he needed to do already, right, by providing these transitional objects. And my qualitative interaction with the employees was totally consistent with the existence of a transitional object. I feel supported, I feel respected, this guy's awesome, and some people got a piece of art that might be worth $200, and they felt the exact same way as the individual who had just decided that they were going to choose a Picasso that might be worth $1 million. It was phenomenal the way this organization responded to this change based on the introduction of that transitional object. Now I'm going to flip it back to Patrick and let him tell you about an example a little bit closer to home.
So it was about a year ago, because it was coming out of the ACMP conference last year, that we decided to use an experiment we saw from one of the presenters with a project team we were working with. And Janine Latini is sitting back there, and we were leading this 50-person project team. They'd been working there for a long time. The clients had a great relationship with them, but we wanted to figure out what we could do better, how we could improve. So instead of asking what we could do better, based on something we saw last year, we asked, okay, what are the limitations? What are the things that could go wrong? And so the direct question was, what would we have to do? What would be the worst thing that could happen to this organization, and what would we do to make that happen? And as much as we were trying to think about our team and ourselves, the answer we consistently got was that if the client leader left, that would be the worst thing that could happen to the organization. So even our staff, who were sitting there as contract employees in this space, felt that the client leader was the key to success. And 3 months later, he left. So it was traumatic for the organization. It was also traumatic for our staff. So we had a meeting. Everybody walked in. I had been working with Victoria at that time, so my transitional object juices were flowing. And I happened to have a lot of toys. Things that we pick up at conferences, things we give out at conferences, I kind of keep them in a big bag in my office. So everyone comes in, they had two things in front of them. They had a set of sunglasses, and they had this object right up here that's at the top. It's called a tangle. The tangle is supposed to be a tactile tool to keep you moving mentally instead of picking up your phone or something else when you're in a conversation. So when they sat down, I said, there are a lot of different responses that you can have to the change of the leader leaving this organization. You can take these sunglasses and you can put them on as blinders. You can be blind to what's going on and you can just try to operate day to day the same. Or you can pick up the tangle and you can fidget with it and you can use all that anxiety to create something new. Because the tool itself will flip around and you can make objects out of it. Those are your choices. My encouragement is that you take the sunglasses and use them outside, but don't use them in the office. And that instead you use the tangle. So then, a couple months later, I'm sitting in a meeting, and I noticed that people still had the tangle, and they were still using it. So the other day we were talking, and Heidi was a part of that team, and I said I was going to tell this story, and Heidi, she still has it. People do attach to these new transitional objects. They become ways to just get your mind off of what's going on, and yet have something new to kind of bring you into the fold and feel comfortable. In Victoria's book, she talks about an empty box that she asks people to carry around during a change, but not open it. There was nothing in the box. It didn't matter. There was something there for them to attach to that was new. And so what we wanted to do in the research was find out what are the transitional objects in these organizations. So what you see here are 5 transitional objects that we identified for federal government employees. They're going to look very similar to research that ProSci has done on successful change factors. You have senior leaders, you have direct supervisors, you have the mission, you have information and skills. These are the things that people attach to in times of change. In the federal government, what we found is that senior leaders, who I told you earlier are leaving every 2.5 years, that has a very different meaning. It's not always, am I attaching to someone for the long term? It's, are they the right person for right now? In the meantime, the direct supervisors are hanging around. They're going to be there for years. They're going to probably retire with me. So there's a different kind of attachment that happens there. The mission, Victoria gave the example of Apple, but in the federal space, many employees are mission-driven. That's why they're there. They believe in what they're doing. And so if the mission changes, what does that do to them? What other transitional object can they pivot to that can help them move through that mission change? In information and skills, this is classic communications and training, right? But what's really critical here is that we're trying to get beyond just communications and training for transition objects. We want you to think about how you could use some of these other tools in your organization and things that people are already attaching to as effective transition objects. So now we're going to walk you through case studies. We have 7 of them. You saw them earlier. They're the different dots that Heidi showed you. And for each of them, we're going to tell you a different story. Depending on how we go with time, we might flip through them to allow some time for questions. But each of them is set up to show you the symptoms of the organization and how we measured them, and also the different transitional objects. And all of them are looking at 2012 and 2015. And we try to describe the change that happened for the organization in that time. Like I said, you have all of this information, because these slides are a little intimidating, I know, compared to the other ones that are used around here. So Heidi's going to kick us off with one of the top Ready for Change organizations.
Thank you. So I get to talk about the very change-ready ones. So the first one is NASA. And I think anyone that's kind of looked into federal government agencies, NASA is always really at the top of the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. It is also at the top of our kind of change readiness scale. So in 2012, NASA is also an organization that over the past 5 years has been going through some major changes. In 2012, the space shuttle program ended. There was a shift away from manned space exploration to unmanned space exploration. exploration, as well as kind of looking at new satellite technology and GIS, GPS technology. What this shows you is that in 2012, NASA was a pretty change-ready organization, and in 2015, it remains to be. That 0.08 change is not significant, meaning what that means is that it really, it's consistently change ready. And then you can see with the transition objects, the variation is minimal. So NASA is very adept to change based off of kind of the analysis that we've done. The second profile is the Highway Administration. Also, over the past 5 to 6 years, the Federal Highway Administration has faced challenges. Gas prices have been fluctuating. There's a lot of kind of infrastructure that's starting to get older. And funding, there's been some funding issues within the Federal Highway Administration. Again, similar to NASA, you see kind of the same sort of in 2012. They were kind of at the top of our scale for change readiness, and they remain to be in 2015. You can also see with the transition objects, when we looked at kind of the data around that, there's also minimal fluctuation there as well. Our third profile, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, this is a really interesting one because we all kind of know a lot of the changes that have been going on with CMS between electronic health records, the Affordable Care Act, a lot of sort of public issues that have kind of come to the light and media. And what you can see here is that according to the change readiness scale, they actually have increased, and this is a significant increase in their change readiness. So you can see in 2012, they were kind of in the high 3s. In 2015, they were in the low 4s. And that change is statistically significant. And when you look to the transition object table, you can see a lot of it is driven by the transition objects of senior leaders, direct supervisors, and information sharing. And communication, which is fascinating when you start to think about those next steps that need to be taken to help improve the change readiness of a variety of different organizations. So then Patrick is going to talk briefly about some of the not as change ready organizations.
Yeah, I'd let Heidi take the positive. I'm the bad guy in this one. So next up is the Veterans Benefit Administration, and this one is squarely in the middle, and this is why we selected them. They're okay, and they've had a lot of change, but they're not going down, which is fascinating. Any of you who are residents in the U.S., you've probably seen the Veterans Administration drag through the mud quite a bit over the last 5 years for many of the different shortcomings and mistakes that have been made. And yet this group is staying pretty constant. In fact, there's been very little change in all the transition objects, which suggests that there's probably a great deal of stability going on beneath the surface, and that stability is what people are using to kind of hold on to. Not surprising, the mission, which I think would be a lot of the reason that people would get into the Veterans Administration, continues to be a pretty strong transitional object for them with high scores. Now let's go to some of the bad, the really bad. All right, so we put TSA in for a very particular reason. No matter where you're coming from to this conference, we know you've seen TSA. And you know they have one of the worst jobs in the world, right? They have to tell us what we can and cannot do on a daily basis, and they have to interact with any traveling person, not just American citizens, and we're bad enough, but any traveling person coming through. High volume, constant changes. The process is always being changed. There's a story every other week about they missed this in this place. They don't know how to do their job well. What have we paid for? We federalized this entire workforce about a decade ago, and we have nothing to show for it. It's all bad. It's all bad. So how do they change? How do they go into, step by step through each of the changes that they need to do? And what we see is that despite all the changes, they don't shift that much. They're not great to start. They're at the bottom, but they're pretty stable. And their transitional object scores are pretty strong, especially the mission, which was interesting to us because we think that that's pretty bad, right? I mean, that's not fun to do. That on a daily basis. But the mission is a very important attachment, transitional object for them. And so what would you do with this information? Well, if you were going into TSA to help them change, you might go in and start to figure out how to use these different transitional objects to help them do some sort of major overhaul. Next up, the Secret Service. Anyone heard anything about the Secret Service in the last few years? Anyone here on a junket right now? Okay, just kidding. Secret Service has had a lot of negative press, But more importantly, it also had significant changes in leadership. And even though there's been this negative press, and they're at the bottom, and you see that change, for those of you who want to geek out on stats later, we can talk about this, but this is beyond statistically significant. This is a very, very strong change. It doesn't get stronger than this over time, because remember, our scale runs basically from 3 to 5, so a 0.42 drop is really, really big. And part of why we jumped on this one in particular was we wanted to understand what the transitional objects could be for the Secret Service. And it's not the senior leaders. In fact, you'll see a lot of press about how the changeover in senior leaders have brought people in who don't understand us. The direct supervisors are still constant. That's good, right? That's some hope. Maybe we can go and talk to them. Maybe they're part of the transitional object for the future, right? Get us some good change. But the mission, they feel, has been torn apart. There's not information sharing. They don't have the skills to do their job. I mean, these are the core elements of what make a successful change effort. And these transitional objects that we want them to attach to move into a new future state aren't there. They don't feel good about them to start. So it's not great for them. And last but certainly not least, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They have a terrible job too. I mean, it's like a common theme, right? They remove people from the country who are here illegally, and nobody agrees on what they should be doing. You know, current news will show you that there's lots of different opinions on whether you build a wall, don't build a wall, do this, don't do that. The last two administrations have dramatically changed the nation's immigration policy without ever engaging Congress. It can be controlled, you know, by the president. And so for them, in November of 2014, when the president released a series of executive orders telling them how to enforce upon the people who are legally present in the country, he changed the mission for the organization, and it was never discussed in advance. There was never an attempt to get the employees on board. And so what you see here is that mission and senior leaders are not the way to drive a change in ICE right now. Those transitional objects are not going to be useful. However, the direct supervisors aren't bad, and the information sharing is something that could be used as a sign of the new wave, right? We're going through a new change, and this time we're going to communicate. Of course, we all know you have to do it. You have to follow through. And if you do, then maybe these transitional objects can help the organization go through a change. So this is the kind of profile that we can create on the agencies. I told you earlier to use the hashtag, attached to change. We're continuing to evolve our research, and in the next month or so, we're going to put out our Shiny app that will be publicly available, where you can look at all the agencies and you can play with the data yourself. We just didn't quite get it ready for this week. So if you put in that hashtag, we'll know to send you all the link so you can play with the data yourself when we launch that. And then we have forthcoming articles as well, and we'll make sure to include all that information on that hashtag going forward. So what does this all mean? Well, we know there's regular change in every organization. We showed you Washington. We argued that the change in Washington is as great as, if not greater than, many of the organizational changes going on in the world. There are some agencies that do things very well, especially information sharing, and that transitional object helps those organizations effectively move through change. There are direct supervisors across the board that the agency employees will really attach to, and that can be a strong transitional object. So we know that change agent networks are important, that sponsors are important, but what we can really put our finger on through this research is, why are they important? Because they're already a transitional object for people. It's already who they're going to lean on, both metaphorically and physically, as they go through a change. And so you need to make sure that they are a part of your change effort. When the mission is something that people can attach to and use as a transition object, don't mess with the mission. Leave the mission alone. explain why everything that you're doing connects to that mission they already love and enjoy, and let it be the transitional object that they're going to stay with as they go through the change. And last, information sharing through senior leaders can go either way. It depends on how well the senior leader is perceived. And so there's a lot of frameworks that tell you that you need your senior leader out there engaged in the change. In some agencies, that might not be the right path forward. Yes, they need to announce it. Yes, they need to be behind it. But maybe they're not the person you put forward. Maybe there's someone who's a little bit closer to the mission and the employees that would serve as a better communicator to enable that transitional object to work effectively. So that's what we've learned about Washington. Victoria is going to tell you how it can be applied more broadly.
So the takeaways from what we just talked about is that attachment is a powerful psychological challenge, right? And it is something that you can't change because it's part of our human instinct, right? And we're wired for it neurologically. So it isn't something that you can make go away. The positive thing is that you have the data. Many of you probably have it sitting available to you right now to be able to define what these attachments look like and how I can insert a transitional object into the workplace so that as we transition through the change, it will be more successful and the return on the investment for the change will be increased. So the important piece is that you have the information probably ready for you right now, and if you don't, it's not that hard to get. This is a critical missing piece to the change models that are out there. There's nothing that identifies this, nothing. So everything that we're talking about is what I like to refer to as beneath the surface. This beneath the surface information is critical for us to be able to measurably increase the success of our change initiatives while supporting our employees and making our workplace a more positive experience for all who are there. So now we'd like to take questions from the audience, and thank you so much for your incredible attention.
Would you mind going to the mic? Thank you.
So I just want to define a little bit. When you say change ready, does that, in my mind, it equates to change agility. Is that accurate or no?
So you got me, Corey? All right, thanks. So I think it could be. We're measuring it over time. So I think that then you could say that if an organization is consistently scoring high on our change ready score, then they would have change agility, right? Because they keep it over time. However, if they start to go down, then that's something that you can start to build before your change, and you can build up your capability a little more effectively before you go forward with that next mission overhaul or senior leader change. Well, that's from just to be completely blunt about it, Washington's about to go through a major transition, right? So aside from what's going on in all of your organizations and how you could leverage something like this within your own organization, we know that all of these 82 agencies that we just looked at are going to have some sort of new leadership. Maybe it's only the president, but it's more likely going to be their director and the 1,500 federal political appointees that are around them are going to be different. So that's what got us excited about this, and understanding which agencies would be ready for that, versus not ready.
And I would just add one thing to that also. The one thing about when we showed the profiles, we showed 2012 and 2015. We weren't making any statement about evaluating a change effort. So the Affordable Care Act, for example, we weren't evaluating at all like the change. Was that change successful? What we were only measuring was the readiness in 2012 and then 2015 of the organization. So I just want to be very clear that it wasn't an evaluation in any case around.
You're looking to measure overall agility and how it correlates to turnover? That's what you just said? Mm-hmm. Okay. I have to repeat it for the microphone, so no worries. Yeah?
Hi, my name is Carolyn from Ottawa, and so I was really interested in your presentation because, of course, in Canada we're going through massive public sector change, and actually very successfully. largely through symbolic actions. So you see, perhaps you have seen our Prime Minister doing one-arm push-ups on television and so on, connecting, I think, this idea of attachment to giving people a case of the hopes. And so I find this whole model very interesting. I had a question for you, and perhaps if you could just select one of the slides that shows your tables.
Sure.
Because I was just trying to understand, and perhaps I missed something, the link between the symptoms and the transition objects. Because are you in effect showing causality here, or is it a case of directional alignment? Since there may be other factors at play, like, for example, our budget has doubled, or it has been cut in half, or we're in the press with a big scandal, or other factors outside of these.
Yeah, so we did not attempt to show causality. We were simply looking to understand what was happening with the transitional objects within the organization and their change readiness. And so the change readiness is what you would do at the start. And if you had never done something like this before in your organization, you would try to understand what the transitional objects were. But then you would also want to know the trend line for those transitional objects, right? Because that would tell you just as much as the baseline that you're at today. And so that's what we were trying to demonstrate here, but no causality. So Vicki is asking about the turnover numbers and the trend line on that. So there's actually a completely different data set for actual separations and turnover within the federal government. And we tried to marry this data set up with it to see if we could make any sorts of causal connections between what was going on in turnover, and we could not. So instead, these are questions that are perceptions of turnover, right? And so the perception of turnover can be much higher than the actual turnover. And that's something we're going to explore in future research, because we already noticed the disconnect between the actual and the perception.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the transitional object becomes so important, right? And defining what the transitional object looked like. So they're attached to the old mission. They were attached to Mr. Jobs, right? And so you have to figure out, what can I do? How can I support my employees? It's going to happen, right? Unfortunately, we were going to lose him, right? And so we had to figure out a way, or they had to figure out a way to make that process smoother. They had many different programs that they inserted, one of which was trying to redefine the mission. The interesting piece is that it didn't work, right? And so they didn't use a symptomatic response to identify the transitional objects. The leaders identified what they thought. And that's the danger, right, in change initiatives, is when you have a team, a change team, and you just use that information that your leaders or the people on the change team, who may or may not actually be the influencers, to make the decisions. The employees, that's why we use the data. That's why it's so incredible when you have data at your organization regarding engagement and job satisfaction that will tell you what your employees need, because it's not really about what the leaders think they need, it's what they actually need, right? Because human instinct is individual, and so you have to be able to understand it at the individual level, and that's why these assessments that you guys have, these huge data many of you have huge data repositories of this information, are so incredibly valuable, because you can just mine that data for this information, or you can get it qualitatively. Like I said, there's several different ways that you can get at the answer, but that's a great question. And your question is exactly pointed at one of our problems with change, and that is that we oftentimes project, that's a psychological term, it's what we call it, project what we think people need onto them, right? Because it's what we might need, but that isn't necessarily what your employees need. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm sorry, we're getting the hook back here. So
okay.
For the next one, but we're around.
Yeah,
so please come talk to us.
Thank
you very
you.
much.
Thank you.